All right, well, so we are picking up on Matthew 1:18. So last time we had an introduction to Matthew, we talked about the different Jewish groups that were existing at Jesus's time. And the big question dividing these groups was much like today with Christianity. Uh, Different Protestant groups will differ about when is Jesus coming back, how is Jesus coming back, etc. And this time the Jews were talking about something similar, which is when is God coming back to fill the second temple? Because he had filled the first temple, but he was never seen to come and fulfill the second temple. And so Jews were wondering, what do we have to do to get God to come back and be with us, to dwell with us again? They had different answers for this. Some were Pharisees, some were Sadducees, and some were Essenes. And the Essenes, maybe there's a big debate about whether John the Baptist was an Essene, but we'll get to that in chapter 3. So, having finished the genealogy, now we get to the birth of Christ. So, Matthew says in verse 18, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just or righteous man, and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. All right, so this is kind of like the story of, and remember in the genealogy, there were 4 women, or actually 5, including Mary, who were listed in the genealogy unusually, because normally it was, and at this time in Judaism, it was patriarchal line of descendancy. So it was through the male line. It's only in modern Judaism or after this time that it switches to the maternal side is how you determine whether you're Jewish or not. So unusually, Matthew adds 5 women into the genealogy of Jesus, one of which is Tamar. And so we already have in our mind the story of Tamar, which is, if we remember from last time, Tamar was married to one of Jacob's sons who died, and it fell on Jacob to give her a child. So he refused to do that. So Tamar ends up tricking him, dressing up as a prostitute, sleeping with him, getting pregnant. And then Jacob discovers that his daughter-in-law has gotten pregnant and it's not by him, so he brings her to a trial. And at the trial, she comes up and gives his ring and his staff that he left with her that night, that they conceived the child. And he realizes that he's been tricked into doing the right thing. But in the same way, Joseph could have brought Mary to trial, like Jacob brought Tamar to trial. But he decides he's just going to put her away secretly, which in a all you needed for a divorce in Judaism was 2 witnesses. So in this case, 2 witnesses to testify that Mary was in fact pregnant. And he would have been able to divorce her easily in this private way. And because he was a just man, he only wanted to do this. He didn't want to make her a public example.
What would have happened to a lady that
Yeah.
divorced that way?
She would have, I mean, the law, according to Deuteronomy, she would be stoned to death.
Oh, really?
Yes, so, and we'll see later too that Mary was also a temple virgin, which even if she wasn't betrothed to Joseph, as a temple virgin, she would have been stoned to death for supposedly breaking her vow.
What would happen to the child if she was stoned to death? I know it's hypothetical, or was it reality
I think it would have gone to the father.
to the father?
Yeah, I would assume so. It's a good question. In practice, it doesn't seem like they were always actually stoned to death, but that was what the law said. So in order to avoid that for her, in order to avoid people calling for her to be stoned to death, he prefers this private divorce. Verse 20, but while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David. Notice he calls him son of David, because this is the important thing, that Jesus is from the line of David, the kingly line. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary, your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit, and she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So Jesus is an interesting name. Of course, it goes back to Yeshua. Yeshua in the Old Testament, which then is translated as Joshua. So the Joshua of the Old Testament, the sixth book of the Old Testament, Joshua, the successor of Moses, who led the people of Israel into the promised land. Joshua is the name of Jesus, and we say it sounds different to us, Jesus and Joshua, because Jesus is the Latin version. It went from Joshua into Greek is Jesus. Greek doesn't have a sh sound, so the sh becomes a s. Isu, Joshua Isu, and then into Latin is Jesus. So, and this word in Yeshua means God saves. God saves. All right, so 22. So all this was done, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. So remember this, the big question in this time was, how do we get God to be with us again? And here comes the answer. Jesus is God with us. Jesus has God become man and is literally God with us. So, yeah.
If people know that Jesus meant Yeshua, and meant God saves, and Emmanuel meant God with us when this was written, because. I mean, I guess I forgot that I ever heard it before, but.
I think it means the anointed one.
Christ means the anointed one.
Oh,
Christos, Messiah, Christ means anointed one. Yeah, it's, well, let me talk about this prophecy a little bit, and maybe I'll make it clear. So Matthew's saying this prophecy, and it's a controversial verse here. He's quoting Isaiah 7:14, but of course, the Matthew that we've received is written in Greek. And the Greek word is, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son. Right? That's the prophecy, that a virgin shall be with child and bear a son. Now, in the original Hebrew, all it says is it uses the Hebrew word alma, which means young woman. So when it was translated, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek in the Septuagint about 250 BC, 250 years before Jesus, they chose to translate the word alma, young woman, as parthenos, virgin. And it certainly can mean this, and this is the obvious meaning, because a young woman was expected at that time not to have sexual relations until she was married, etc. So it's easy to see why they picked this term virgin rather than young woman, but it doesn't necessarily mean that she was sexually chaste. So what's going on in the original context of this prophecy? It comes from Isaiah 7:14. It's during the Syro-Ephraimite War. So Judah and Israel are fighting each other at this point. And the king of Judah is in trouble. And he asks the prophet Isaiah, is God going to deliver us? And Isaiah says, yes, a young woman will bear a child. And then it continues, while still a baby, he will eat curds, and before he knows how to choose the good from the evil, you will be delivered. So the prophecy is that a woman will bear a child, and it could just be, doesn't necessarily imply a virgin birth. A woman will bear a child while still a baby, God will deliver you, is what he's saying. So in other words, within 2-3 years, what you're asking will come to pass. This is the prophecy, that you will be delivered within the next 2 or 3 years. That's the original context of the prophecy. Now, why is it important that it was translated Parthenos? All right, and this is more accurate. So Parthenos didn't just mean in this time period in the Greek-speaking world as well as the Jewish-speaking world. Parthenos, virgin, didn't just mean religiously, sexually chaste. It was also kind of a technical term, which we see also elsewhere in the New Testament. And it's almost like it's a religiously dedicated virgin. So almost like what we would consider a nun today. They had this conceptual category of something like a nun. And not only in the pagan world, which we know they did in the pagan world, for example, in Rome, they had the Vestal virgins dedicated to the god Vesta in Rome. And these young women would dedicate themselves to Vesta and live in the temple of Vesta as Vestal virgins. And so Judaism, we know from Second Maccabees, also had, not in the earliest part of Israelite history, but by the time of Second Maccabees, so 200 years before Jesus, they also, it seems, there's reference in Second Maccabees to virgins in the Jerusalem temple. So Jewish virgins dedicated to the Jewish God Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple. And this is what Mary was, according to tradition. Mary wasn't simply a virgin in that she was sexually chaste. She was dedicated to the service of God by her parents. And that's what we celebrate November 21st. For example, November 21st is the feast of the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple. So at 3 years old, after she was weaned, her parents brought her and dedicated her to the temple, meaning she lived there at the temple or in the temple precincts as a virgin. Yeah.
But the Greeks also had them, especially at the
Yes.
Athenaeum for the Parthenon, the virgins had a special place in the procession. And they were dedicated to Athena.
Exactly.
And, well, so just as in Rome or temple, I guess.
Yeah.
And Parthenos, what age group? I mean, Mary, I think, had Jesus when she was about 15.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I'm gonna get to that one with her story here in a second.
Is this like an so was there like an Old Testament precursor to monasticism?
Yes, so what we hear about in the Second Maccabees, so not earlier. I mean, you have the prophets who live a very kind of, you look at Elijah, for example, he's not married, he lives a kind of monastic kind of.
It's basically a desert father.
Yes, he's kind of a desert father before they existed. And so there was this idea of people who are dedicated to God, even like the Nazirite vow, which actually we'll talk about later. The Nazirite vow, certain Jews would take a vow, they would cut their hair and take a Nazirite vow, meaning that they would remain sexually chaste, they wouldn't drink alcohol, and they dedicated themselves to God. And usually it was for a period.
Wouldn't eat meat too.
What's that?
Wouldn't eat meat too.
Wouldn't eat meat, right?
But did they do that at a certain age or at any time they want? Because like, and I'm maybe wrong, but with the bar mitzvahs, the
Right.
Jews have, it's like 12, 13 years old. And from what I remember, when I was brought up, when we bring a baby into the church, the godparents responsible for guiding the baby for 12 years. Is that any significance?
That's a
Or
good
the-
question.
or
There's
the adult, yeah.
There's gotta be, I mean, like the Nazirite vow could be taken by anyone at any time, so it didn't have to be as a child. But when we get to the Maccabean period, 200 BC, it seems that what happened as generally and what happened to Mary in particular was that she was brought at 3 years old, which we celebrate on November 21st. And then she stayed there until she came, until puberty, basically. Then because there were purity laws in the temple, one of the big ones was blood. And so when she comes of age and reaches the age of menstruation, that's when they say, okay, now we'll find her, she can no longer live in the temple. But until then, she lived in the temple precincts, she was fed in the temple precincts, she grew up and was entirely dedicated there. But at the time of her coming of age, she was wedded or betrothed to Joseph, who according to our tradition, it's not in the Gospels, was an older man, was a widower, and who already had children from a previous marriage, who ends up being like James, for example, the brother of the Lord, is his half-brother through Joseph. All right, so Mary lived in the temple from 3 until probably around 13, 14, something like that, where she was a dedicated virgin. All right.
Is that when she was betrothed to Joseph?
Yeah, probably around 12 or 13.
Yeah, because that practice, in the old country, in Ramallah over there, like with her grandmother and people long time ago, they would have the agreements that, like her grandmother was betrothed at 11.
Right.
And all they did was play in the yard until about 13, 14 with blood.
Right.
And then they consummated the marriage.
Yeah.
So they were kind of following the law, I guess.
Yeah.
At that time.
Yeah, something similar was happening at this time. Although it seems that the priests arranged Mary's marriage to Joseph because probably by that time her parents Joachim and Anna had already died because they were very old when they had her to begin with. So she's betrothed to Joseph. Let's see what else I wanted to say. All right, so another thing to remember is in the Old Testament, especially with Matthew, and especially here at the beginning of Matthew, he's quoting a lot from the Old Testament, a lot, showing how the prophecies from the Old Testament are fulfilled in Jesus. That's what he's intending to show, because Matthew's audience, he's writing mainly for Jews who know the Old Testament well, who respect the Jewish culture and traditions, and are expecting Jesus to be in this model of the Jewish Messiah, right? So Matthew is really emphasizing all the Old Testament background and prophecies that are fulfilled in Jesus. But we have to remember that at this time in history, there were no chapters and verses in the scriptures, right? That only comes about much later, like in the 1300s. In the West, they finally put chapter and verses in. So at this time, there was no way to say, see verses, Isaiah 7 through whatever. So what they did was they would cite the first or most important line in a section, and that would alert the reader, remember this whole story, right? Instead of copying down the whole story, they would just put one line, and you're supposed to remember the whole story. So it's not, we tend to read it as coming in from a Protestant culture, we tend to read the text as like proof texts, right? That it's when he cites a line, we're delving into every word on that line that he cites and trying to see where the parallel is with Jesus. But in his mind, he wants you to recall the whole story behind it. So the whole context of the prophecy. So it goes deeper. So Isaiah is saying with this line, to the king of Judah, a child will be born and you will be delivered from your enemies. And Matthew sees this as a parallel with Jesus, that this is the same thing that Matthew is saying about Jesus. Jesus is the child that will be born and deliver Israel from its enemies.
So they're connecting the dots from the old to the new.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and so he's showing that in the context of this saying from Isaiah 7:14, if you read the whole story, you see that so it doesn't just focus on the translation of not everything doesn't hinge on the translation of this word parthenos as virgin, because the broader context is, yes, Matthew does see it as important that it was translated into Greek as virgin because Mary really is and remains a virgin, but also in the greater context, it's talking about a child being a sign of Israel being delivered from its enemies. And so that's the parallel with Jesus. Let me see here. There was a good explanation in this book, actually.
And that's where we need to have you teach us the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Interpret the Old Testament.
Especially Isaiah.
Instead of us just reading it, yeah.
Imagine how much less things were taken out of context when you didn't have verses.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So here, he explains here in Isaiah 7, so this quote's coming from Isaiah 7:14, and in Isaiah chapter 7, the thought is as follows: Ahaz, the king of Judah, is exhorted not to rely upon Assyria for help against Syria. Those are two different countries, Assyria and Syria, for help against Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. So, in other words, Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel have allied against the southern kingdom of Judah. Instead, the king is tempted to go to a third power, Assyria, and make a treaty with them to help defeat their enemies and be saved. But God wanted them to rely upon God, not rely upon Assyria. So, through the prophet Isaiah, Ahaz, the king of Judah, is invited to ask God for a sign that God will help them. Ahaz wants to trust Assyria for help rather than God, and so declines the sign, declines asking for a sign, which Isaiah ends up giving anyway. God gives this sign to Ahaz anyway, and the sign is this: that an Alma, young woman, will conceive and give birth to a son, presumably in the usual way, following marriage and sexual conception. This boy, it goes on to say in the very next verse, will eat curds and honey, the fruit of a desolate and unfarmed land, before he is old enough to refuse evil and choose good. So it's predicting, again, that the great desolation is going to occur in the land. That's why the child is eating curds and honey. But before he's old enough to refuse evil and choose good, whatever that means, maybe 3 or 4 years old, that Israel will be delivered from its enemies. The kings of Syria and Israel will be swept away before the king of Assyria, and Judah will be desolate. That's what ends up happening, because the king of Judah relies on this foreign power, Assyria. Assyria ends up helping Judah and then coming in and wiping them all out anyway. So this boy and the timing of his birth will thus be a sign that God is with his people. Emmanuel, God is with us, and that he will yet save them. All right. So, God is still gone from the temple in the perspective of the Jews at this time. But what Matthew is saying is when you see Jesus born, you'll see that God is back with us. Emmanuel, God is with us. So you have the Essenes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees all arguing about what's the best way to get God to come back. Here comes Matthew saying, God has already come back in the form of Jesus. We don't need to worry about following the law perfectly like the Pharisees say, or performing the sacrifices correctly by the correct priests, as the Sadducees and Essenes say. God has taken the initiative and condescended to become man. All right, 24. Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. All right, so it's interesting that Joseph, the name Joseph should make the reader think back to the Old Testament Joseph at the end of Genesis. The last chapters of Genesis are all taken up with the Joseph story, or the Joseph cycle, it's called. But it's interesting here, before we get into that parallel, that Joseph, being aroused from sleep, took to him his wife. Where else do we have a man being aroused from sleep and finding himself with a wife?
Adam.
Adam, exactly. So it's interesting that this parallel, that, the Adam falls asleep, and from his rib is taken and fashioned. His rib is taken and fashioned into woman. So when he's aroused from sleep, he finds that he has a wife. So the same thing happens now to Joseph. So we're going back. There's all these parallels with the Genesis story, which Matthew is consciously trying to parallel the beginning of his gospel with Genesis, showing that there's a new. Genesis means beginning, so that there's a new beginning happening now with Jesus. All right, so this verse about and he, Joseph, did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son. All right, so many Protestants will harp on this verse when talking about her ever virginity, right? So the church's position, both the West and the East, both Orthodox and Catholic, is that Mary was ever virgin from before and even after her birth, that she was always a virgin for the entirety of her life, in accordance with this idea that she was a Parthenos, she was a virgin. So even though she could no longer stay in the temple precincts because of the issue of blood, it didn't mean that she stopped being a dedicated virgin. She was still a nun, so to speak, right? But she was, for practical reasons, given over to the protection of this older man, Joseph. So even the reformers, the early classical reformers in the 1500s, like Luther and Calvin, all assumed that Mary was ever virgin. Right. It's only later that some radical Protestants start questioning her ever virginity.
Does the church have anything on the age difference between Mary and Joseph?
Only according to tradition that he was much older.
He was an elder.
Yeah.
Why do they bash Mary so?
I think it's because of the abuses of the Catholic Church. I think, the Catholic Church shares our view of Mary, that she was ever virgin, but sometimes the Catholic Church I think in the Middle Ages, during this period of kind of corruption, that there was a certain Mariolatry developed, a certain kind of idolatrous worship of Mary. It became too much. In fact, this made an impression on me. They did this big survey in the Catholic world, like Latin America and so on. And they asked Catholics, who do you pray to when you're in trouble? And Jesus was sixth. Jesus was number 6.
Who was number one?
Mary.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Yeah, Mary, and then I think Saint Anthony, then the Pope, and then, you know, and then Jesus is down at number 6. So I think the Protestants probably are right to push back on some of the extraordinary claims that the Catholic Church makes. Like even in recent years, they've declared Mary to be the co-mediatrix. So it says in the scriptures that Jesus is the only mediator between God and man, but the Catholic Church says no, actually Mary co-mediates with him. So the Orthodox Church would say, we wouldn't put it that way, right? We wouldn't say
But some of
that.
this stuff goes off scripture, because they say, well, she was just a girl like anyone else.
Just human.
And like, that's not true. If you didn't even just read this, you know, that's not true. And
Right.
of course, she wasn't a virgin. They're just making that up and.
Right.
I feel like they wanna make her relatable
Yeah.
too.
How?
I don't know.
Well, and then there was this too, that even in the Old Testament, if you go back to Numbers, there was a Jewish midrash, meaning a later Jewish commentary on this section from Numbers, where it was the two elders who remained in the camp when Moses divided the spirit among the 70 elders. There were 2 that remained in the camp, Eldad and forget the other one's name. And the Jewish commentators say, oh, how unfortunate for their wives that they were visited by the Holy Spirit, because it means it meant in the ancient mind, in the not only Jewish mind, obviously, but even in the Greek and pagan mind, if someone was dedicated to God, that was something that didn't just kind of wear off, right? That it held on. It was a lifelong responsibility. And so, and actually in the 4th century, 4th, 5th century, you have Saint Jerome responding to to some critics who are already pointing out this verse and saying, well, what does it mean? You know, if it says, and did not know her until she had brought forth her firstborn son. Some heretics were questioning what that meant. And so Saint Jerome, even in the 5th century, he goes, and I'm going to steal his response. This is the same way we can respond to the Protestants today, is that Saint Jerome looks at Genesis. And if you look at Genesis, there's a story where Jacob steals his father-in-law's idols and buries them under a tree. And then the text says in Genesis, and they've not been found until this day. So Jerome says, does that mean they were found today? You know, obviously not. It means a phrase that means they've never been found, right? So at the end of Deuteronomy, it says Moses died and they buried his body, and that his body has not been found until this very day. Does that mean they found it that day? No, it means it's never been found. Isaiah 46:3, God says to the prophet, you have been carried by me, God. You, Israel, have been carried by me from your birth until your old age. Does that mean God abandoned Israel in its old age? No. So there's all these examples from scripture where until doesn't mean what it means in English, right? So in English and some other languages, this word until implies that then it happened. But in the original Greek that it's written in, it doesn't imply that. It could mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that. So that's our answer to the Protestants who harp on this verse.
What's the verse again?
Let's see, Matthew 125.
25.
Yeah,
But still the until, when you try to talk about it with others, is very difficult to communicate.
yeah, it is. But, you know, then you have to ask them too, what, you know, in the ancient world, it would be assumed, even in not only among the Greeks and the pagans, but also the Jews, that if God had worked through you, that you remained kind of untouchable, right? Forever. And so why would it seem natural for Mary to bear God himself, the God of the whole world who created the whole universe, and then have relations with Joseph, right? It doesn't seem like it makes sense.
Can you clarify something though?
Yeah,
So you said that when a virgin was dedicated to the temple, that vow didn't wear off.
right.
But Mary was betrothed to Joseph before the vision, right?
Right,
So.
right, so she was betrothed, but with the sense that it would be a white marriage, that it would be a non-sexual marriage, because there was really no other option in society.
Oh, because she
for her.
couldn't stay in the temple.
She couldn't stay in the temple, her parents had died,
Yes.
and a woman couldn't be independent at that time in
Yeah.
Jewish history, so she had to be under the protection of someone. The safest bet seemed like this pious, righteous older man who already had children and was a widower.
My Protestant friends are smart, so I have to.
Yeah. Yeah,
I gotta be as smart.
I think they are.
I think they
I
are.
think they are.
all right, so that's the end of chapter 1. All right, so now we roll into chapter 2. Verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. All right, so these wise men or magi were were from the Persian priestly class. So in the east of the from the Mediterranean, from the Promised Land, went east into Persia. And so these magi, or what's translated as wise men, but could be translated as magicians, were this from this Persian priestly class. They were skilled in astrology. Now, interestingly, how many wise men are there? Three, right? But does the text say three?
No,
It just says-
a lot of wise.
It says wise men. So interestingly, Saint John Chrysostom, who's the biggest interpreter in the East in the Orthodox Church, and Saint Augustine, who's the biggest interpreter in the West in the Catholic Church, both say that there were 12. Because it was a symbol, a number of wholeness. It's all, some other fathers say that there were 3, and that's derived from the idea that there were 3 gifts, and so therefore there were 3 magi to deliver these 3 gifts, but the text doesn't say how many there were. So why does it, and we're gonna see here in chapter 2 that Matthew spends a long time, most of chapter 2, I think of all of chapter 2, discussing the story of the Magi coming, worshiping Jesus, and their conflict, the conflict with Herod, and the Magi leaving secretly. Why does Matthew spend so much time on the story of the Magi, who, if he's writing for a Jewish audience, the Magi are foreigners, right? They're pagans. They worship fire at this point. They're Zoroastrian, probably. So what Matthew is trying to show is, even though he's writing for a Jewish audience, he wants to make it clear from the very get-go that Jesus is not just the Messiah for the Jews. It's not just a king for the Jews, but he's meant to be king of the whole world, of all the nations. And all the nations, in keeping with some of the prophecies from the Old Testament, would come and worship the King of Israel. So Jesus is for the Jewish people. He's the fulfillment of the Jewish hopes, but he also is here to serve all mankind. All right, so when it says, for we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. We know the story of the Magi following the star, right? So the fathers of the church say, there's all sorts of speculation about what this star was. Now, some people, like including Father Lawrence Farley here, is an Orthodox writer, he speculates that there was, it seems, in 7 BC, there was an alignment of Saturn and Jupiter or something, and then the next year in 6 BC it further aligned with Mars, and so there was this kind of cosmic alignment of the planets. That could be what they're talking about. Personally, I don't find that very convincing, because when you follow the story, it says that the star even leads them to a specific house. And so how could the alignment of Jupiter and Mars possibly send you to a specific house, right? That's impossible. So what the fathers of the church say is that it was an angel manifesting itself as a star. And that the angel, it was this kind of noetic star, that because they were earnestly seeking God, God gave them the sight to see this star. And so it may be that the star wasn't even visible to other people. It could have been, but it may not have been. But it was this angel that God sent to lead them because they were earnestly seeking the truth.
I read that the Zoroastrian priests were astrologers, and so they put a lot of meanings of the
Yes.
stars, planets, and so that makes sense to me that, okay, they would divine that this is happening from,
Right.
I don't know how exactly, but.
And then it makes
stuff in the
sense that
skies.
the idea is that God condescends to use the language that these non-Jews can understand, right? Because he knows that they are constantly looking up at the stars, he uses the image of a star to lead them to the truth. But this is important to understand about this astrology at the time, because it's not like astrology today, where you open up the newspaper and tells you you're a Libra and you're gonna meet a new friend today or whatever. This is the idea in the ancient world, not just for the Persians, but for the whole ancient world that was united by this Greek education. So even the Jews were influenced by this and were interested in astrology, although they weren't supposed to be. Was the idea was that the sky, the heavens were a mirror of the earth. And so if you look carefully and observe the movement and appearance of stars in the sky, this portended, reflected what was about to happen on earth, right? So it was a way of prophesying, it was a way of predicting what was gonna happen.
Sky clock, is what they call it.
Yes, and if a new star appearing or a new something appearing meant the arrival of a new king, a new power. That was how they typically interpreted the appearance of a new object in the night sky. It meant that a new power was appearing on the world stage. So this is probably how they viewed this star that they saw. They would have interpreted it as a new power has come onto the world stage. The star leads them exactly to who this new power is, who is Jesus. So the earth and the heavens correspond in this
Did
prophecy.
Herod believe that?
Yeah, that's a
I mean,
good question.
he allegedly took action, so, I
Right.
mean, was he following the stars or?
Well, yeah, it's because, and Herod, of course, wasn't exactly a pious Jew. He wasn't even really a Jew. He was a kind of a quasi Jew, mixed race. He was really an Idumean. So it's entirely possible that he did believe in this talk about the stars and that he would have respected the Magi as experts in this field. So it says in 2:3, the next verse, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So apparently he does believe it to some extent, or he's worried enough about it. And we know that many rulers feared astrological signs of their demise. The Emperor Nero reportedly slaughtered many nobles in the hope that their deaths, rather than his own, would fulfill the prediction of a comet that had come by. We know that Herod, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we know that Herod had many family members killed to protect. He actually had 3 of his own sons killed, 2 of whom were innocent, to protect his position on the throne.
So nobody would take his place.
Yes.
Rise to his place, and he was afraid of the star taking his place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he already has a reputation in history as being paranoid. So verse 5, so they said to him, in Bethlehem of where he asks the chief priests and scribes, where is the Messiah supposed to be born, the new king? So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet Micah. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. All right, so this is what they come back to him with the prophecy from Micah. And so Herod takes this, and in verse 7 it says, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. So we already get the sense that this is a trick, right? He really he's tricking them into finding the child for him so that he can go and kill the child. Verse 9, when they heard the king, they departed. And the text doesn't indicate that they had any reason to be suspicious of him at this time. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And the word there, worship, is proskino, which means they fell down on their face. It's not latria, it's not latrevo, which is normally translated worship. Here it's venerated. They venerated him like we venerate an icon. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And there's a lot of talk in the fathers about what these three things represent. Gold represents his divinity. Frankincense represents incense that priests would offer in the temple, and myrrh represents the burial anointing. So predicting his death, so that Jesus was both king and priest, and that he would die. All right, 2:12. Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. So there's lots of dreams going on. Joseph in this chapter has 4 dreams from God. And the wise men also have dreams from God. It's interesting that if you look at the fathers are almost unanimous in being very suspicious of dreams. So even though here in the scriptures, it's giving us all these important incidents in which God used dreams to provide a real message from God. The fathers of the church, however, are very suspicious of dreams and say that most of the time they don't mean anything, and that they can in fact be used by the evil one. So it's interesting that the church, even though here God used them, the church encourages us to be very careful about what we accept when we have a dream. I have heard cases in Greece where people had dreams that seemed to me to be from God, but it's not common, not common. All right, so where was I? 2:13? 12. Okay, they departed for their own country another way. 2:13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet Hosea, saying, Out of Egypt I called my son. All right, so this section, there's another prophecy from Hosea. And again, we need to look at the whole, all he's quoted is out of Egypt I called my son, but we have to look at the whole context. So in context, Hosea 11:1 refers plainly to the Israelites leaving Egypt in the Exodus, right? Matthew applies this text to Jesus because Jesus epitomizes and fulfills Israel's history. The broader context of Hosea 11 promises a new Exodus and an era of salvation, right? So this is what Jesus is bringing. Jesus is the new Moses. So remember, with Moses too, Pharaoh ordered all the children 2 and under to be killed, right? So that his purpose was that the Hebrew people were becoming too numerous, and he feared they would take over in Egypt. So he orders all the 2-year-olds killed, and Moses miraculously escapes by being put into a basket, etc. So Jesus is being shown in the same way to escape this death sentence for all 2-year-olds and under. He survives by hiding in Egypt, whereas Moses survives by being put into a basket in the river in Egypt. And so Jesus is going to lead this new Exodus. He's going to be the new Moses leading Israel out of slavery. And then he's not only going to be like the new Moses, but also like the new Joshua, Moses' successor, who then eventually leads them into the promised land, which is the kingdom for us. All right, so yeah, and of course, we have to have in our mind the story of Joseph, the patriarch in Genesis. Joseph was sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt where he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, which lead him to become a high official, a second in command in all of Egypt after the Pharaoh. And because of that, because of his interpretation of dreams, He was then, in his moving up to become a high official, he was able to move the rest of his family out of the promised land to Egypt because of a famine in the promised land. So God used the evil intent and machinations of his brothers to end up protecting God's people. So the same thing is happening here. That, and you gotta understand this parallel. When he says, out of Egypt, I called my son, in the scriptures, in Hosea and Isaiah, this idea developed of corporate personality, it's called, that the one, especially in Isaiah, like chapters 40s and 50s, you see clearly this idea that Israel as a collective is the son of God. But then Israel kind of becomes symbolized in the person of its king. And the king is thought of as the son of God also. So you have this interplay between Israel as a whole being God's son, God's beloved, and Jesus as the kind of representative of Israel as its true king is his son. Also, it represents Israel, all of Israel. And then all of us who participate in Jesus's body are in fact part of the new Israel. All right.
Father, it says on line 214, the note here says that in Genesis 39-47, now Christ's stepfather Joseph finds safety for the saviors in Egypt. It is probable that the gifts of the Magi paid for this journey. What journey are we talking
So,
about?
yeah, it's too bad Matt's not here. So, we just, a week or two ago, we venerated the gifts of the Magi, which are located at St. Paul's Monastery, Agio Pavlo in Mount Athos. And they were delivered there by the Byzantine or Serbian empress who acquired them hundreds of years ago and donated them to St. Paul's Monastery on Mount Athos for safekeeping. And they claim to be the actual gifts that were given to Christ, or at least part of the gifts that were given to Christ. The interesting thing is that the three things, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh, were actually kind of combined by a jeweler into these little things that look like purses. And there are like 27 or 28 of these little purses that would have been used as you could have traded them as money, you could have sold them as jewelry, which was also a way of keeping wealth on you. So anyway, according to the tradition of the church, at least some of these gifts still exist and are held by the church. Let's see.
So they were just sold to anybody, basically, the gifts, the one the jeweler put in purses.
Yeah, at some point, this jeweler merged them together into this kind of jewelry, which I guess would have made it easier to carry this wealth, and then you could sell it if you had to. All right. 216. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. So again, it's setting up Herod as the new Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh killed the children under 2, which led Moses to rise up and lead the people out of Egypt. So Herod is playing the role of the Pharaoh. Jesus is going to rise up and lead people out from his tyranny and into the promised land, the kingdom. All right, so Herod, and this idea that Herod would slaughter, and the church's tradition is that he slaughtered 14,000 innocents, right? And the number is probably symbolic of a very large number. Because if we look at if we guess what the population was of at that time in Bethlehem in the region, it wouldn't have been probably even 14,000 people. So the actual number was probably less, although we have no way of knowing. And it's not unbelievable that Herod would do something like this, because as I said earlier, he was known to be very paranoid and willing to kill his own family. So there's another instance in which a high priest had a drowning accident in a pool that was only a few feet deep at the hand of Herod. And then, enraged at his favorite wife, Herod had her strangled, discovering her innocence only afterward. He was deceived into having two innocent sons executed, and on his own deathbed, Herod had another son executed. Although probably fictitious, a purported comment of the emperor, the Roman emperor, is appropriate. Apparently, the Roman emperor said, "Better to be one of Herod's pigs than his son." This is the reputation that he had. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian from the first century, reports that Herod ordered nobles executed at his death to ensure mourning when he died. Instead, they were released at his death, producing celebration.
What's the distinction, innocent sons and another son?
The other one apparently was guilty.
What's guilt?
Yes.
Okay.
So is there any evidence that Herod killed children from another source? 'Cause
Let's see. Well, from a historical source like Josephus.
something, because I've heard people say, well, this didn't happen either, it's a
Right.
Christian fiction.
Right. I don't think there is an account of it happening outside of the
But why
scripture.
would it, I mean, if it was so common, why would they write it down, just
Right.
killing everybody else?
Right, yeah, it wouldn't have been uncommon at that time, and the numbers probably, I mean, practically speaking, were significantly less than 14,000, so it may not have measured up, it might not have been newsworthy. But one of Herod's fortresses, which was called the Herodium, was actually within sight of Bethlehem, and he could have easily dispatched guards from there to go out and kill all the 2-year-olds and under in that region. Let's see. All right, so verse 17. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, "A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more." So this passage from Jeremiah refers in the bigger context, again, we're taking this opening line and looking at the whole section. The Jeremiah passage refers to the outpouring of wrath upon Israel at the time of the Assyrian captivity, so around 700 BC. Rachel, the wife of Jacob, who had died before that, long before that, was buried in Ramah, which is near Bethlehem, according to Genesis 35:19. Jeremiah portrays her, even though she's dead, he portrays her poetically as mourning her lost descendants who have
Her
been
people.
her people who are being killed by Herod. So in context, Jeremiah is speaking about the loss of the children of the northern kingdom, which at this time, the northern kingdom is lost to the Assyrians, and the people of the northern 10 tribes of the northern kingdom are spread out all over Assyria. Rachel is poetically told to restrain her voice from weeping. Why? Because according to Jeremiah, all Israel will be restored when God will, quote, make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Jeremiah 31:31. So that same section that this is from, if you read the whole thing, the good news is, okay, Rachel's weeping and refuses to be comforted, but this is a sign that God will make a new covenant with his people. So Israel's sufferings are thus a prelude to salvation. So what Matthew is trying to say is, look, the same thing is happening here with the slaughter of the innocents, the slaughter of all these 2-year-olds and under. It's a prelude to salvation when God will fulfill this promise he made of making a new covenant with Israel. All right, Matthew 2:19. Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph. This is the third dream in this chapter. In Egypt, where Joseph was, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead." Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, his fourth in this chapter, he turned aside into the region of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. All right, so there's several things here. So for the timeline, how old, some people ask, well, how many years was Jesus in Egypt? How old was he when he came back? So our best guess, most scholars now believe that Jesus was probably born in 4 BC. So not in the year 1. There was no year 0, first of all. There was year 1 BC into 1 AD. So Jesus wasn't born in 1 AD, which was a kind of a guess of a medieval monk when he tried to put together the new calendar. But actually, Jesus was probably born in 4 BC. Herod the Great dies in 6 AD. So if we know that pretty certainly from other historical documents. So in that case, Jesus would have been about 10 when he returned from Egypt to the Holy Land. So that's interesting. So, and he would have been around 2 when he went to Egypt. So he probably spent the ages from 2 to 10, about 8 years in Egypt in hiding. And there was a large Jewish population. As much as 1/3 of Alexandria was Jewish. So there's a very large Jewish
Did you
population.
visit his house in Alexandria? I think sometimes the cops have a
Oh,
couple
yeah.
places where they say he lived, but I don't know.
Yeah, the cops do have a lot of traditions about his time in Egypt. Yeah, I don't know all of them, but yeah. When I went to Alexandria a couple of years ago, there was really very little left from the old city. And most of it had been, most of the city has been as much newer. All right, so where does he get this? He shall be called a Nazarene, which was spoken by the prophets. All right, the problem here is that there's nowhere in the Old Testament where it says he shall be called a Nazarene. So where is he getting this, and why is he saying that it was spoken by the prophets, plural, and not citing which one? So in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "A shoot will come from the stump of Jesse, and a branch will grow from its roots." The Hebrew word for branch is nezer. So the prophecy is talking about the now humbled house of David. Just as a tree can be cut down and a small twig grow from its stump, so the house of David, or Jesse, Jesse was David's father, will still produce the great messianic king. It is a prophecy of the coming Messiah compared here to a humble branch. The image is found in Jeremiah and Zechariah as well. This idea of the new king as this humble branch. So Nezer and Nazarite and Nazarene all sound similar in Hebrew. And in the Hebrew scriptures, they make lots of word plays. So it's thought that this is what he's talking about, is that the prophets said that Jesus will be like this branch coming from a stump, as it was said in Isaiah 11:1. All right, so Matthew takes this, the idea that Nazareth shares this name Nezer because it's pointing to Jesus as the branch. But in reality, Nazareth was a kind of surprising place for Jesus to choose to go, because Nazareth in Galilee was kind of backwoods, it was kind of like I don't know, like flyover country, we would say, in the United States, it wasn't one of the big population centers.
Is anything good coming out of Nazareth?
Right. Yeah, Nazareth, by all indications at that time, was very small and insignificant. It's
He
interesting.
said it has a bad reputation.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's what it says here. It says Nazareth did not have a good reputation.
Hmm.
John 1:46.
Okay, oh, yeah, what, can anything good come
Can
out of
anything-
Nazareth? So, yeah, there was this idea that it was small and insignificant, that nothing
That's
ever
maybe
happened.
why I
there.
picked it, because if you're trying to hide from Herod.
Right.
And you're,
Right, and he says that he came back and to Judea, but Archelaus was governing. So after the death of Herod the Great, who was king, really he was called the ethnarch, the head of the people of all of Israel. When he died, the Romans felt that he probably had too much power. So they split his kingdom into 4 tetrarchies, they called it. A tetrarch, meaning a tetrarch was the head of a fourth. So 4 of his sons became tetrarchs, meaning each ruled a quarter of what was Judea. So Archelaus had a bad reputation as being just like his father, Herod the Great. And so when Joseph comes back and he hears Archelaus is ruling over this quarter that included Judea and Jerusalem, he decides to move to where one of the other sons is, who has a less bad reputation. So he moves up to Galilee. All right. All right, so that is the end of chapter 2, and we're at 11:30, so that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up next week, chapter 3, with the appearance of John the Baptist. So we're gonna skip Jesus from from 10, when he returns from Egypt, let's say, we're not gonna hear anything until he's baptized at around 30 years old, so we're gonna skip 20 years.
Father, whatever happened to Joseph? It
All
seems that
right.
Father, whatever happened to Joseph? It seems that he just disappears. It seems the last mention of Joseph is maybe when Jesus
Yeah.
was in the temple at 12 years old, and then we never hear anything.
Right, the last time we hear from him in Matthew is when Jesus is presumably around 10 years old when they return from Egypt. Then in Luke, we hear that Joseph was there when he was left behind in Jerusalem and he was preaching in the temple, being about his father's business at 12, and then we don't hear from him after that. So the church's position is that precisely because Joseph was a widower and was already in older age when he betrothed Mary, that by the time sometime after Jesus was 12 and his baptism at 30, Joseph died. Right, which would have made sense given his probable age if he really was this elderly widower. So Joseph probably dies shortly after Jesus is 12, and that's why he disappears from the scene.
So he didn't witness Jesus's ministry?
Right, that's assumed, yeah. Yeah. We don't know that for sure, but
Yeah,
Father, I have a question about the gifts of the Magi and
Yeah.
how they are on Mount Athos. Are they in their original form or have they been shaped into this jewelry, purse-like jewelry? I'm confused
yeah,
why.
they're not in their original form. They've been shaped into this jewelry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the gold and the frankincense has been manipulated into a single, 27 or 28 of these little, they look like kind of mini purses.
Were those ever
Yeah.
sold or something?
We don't know. That's
Who
all we
did,
know is,
who
yeah.
did that? How did they get their hands on it and all that?
We don't know. I mean, it would have went to Egypt for several years. It would have come back with the Holy Family. So who knows what happened in all those years?
Where's the Ark of the Covenant too?
The Ethiopians say that the Ark of the Covenant is located in Ethiopia, but there's not real good reason to
Yeah,
accept that. Probably it's destroyed.
Read Mark Twain.
yeah, but it's non-existent.
The Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's gone, it's finished.
Probably it was
Yeah.
destroyed by the invaders,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you know, there's a tradition that it survived,
That
so.
it survives somewhere.
But I think in Ethiopia, they don't allow, there's actually a monk who's the guardian of the Ark of the Covenant. And I think people aren't allowed to see it. The only person who's allowed to see it is this one monk.
I think it's extremely hard to, if it's there, I think it's also very steep terrain. And it's really dangerous to even get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Makes sense.
Like it's a hazard to, even access.
Yeah. All right,
Thank you.
see you guys next week. Bye, everyone.